It's Emily OFC Podfic. Flashpoint. Written by It's Emily OFC. Read by It's Emily OFC. Chapter 14. During some of the toughest challenges Station 10 had had to offer, Kakashi had occasionally retreated into his imagination, picturing the relief he would feel once he returned back to Station 15. Good old Station 15, where he was responsible for virtually no paperwork. Station 15 where, if the crew had to perform some undesirable task, he wasn't to blame. Station 15 where his teammates had the decency not to worry about the contents of the book he was always reading. And while he had left Station 10 undeniably proud of what he had accomplished there, and certainly grateful that the assignment had introduced Tenzō into his life, Kakashi had very much been looking forward to making those imaginations a reality. Returning to Station 15 should have been something of a new beginning for him, a return to comfort with a new appreciation for it to boot. As it was, though, the whole experience had been irredeemably soured. When Kakashi had imagined this day in his mind, he'd had visions of strolling into the station 10 to 15 minutes late, relaxing on a couch and reading without interruption until the alert tone saw fit to interrupt him. Instead, he had arrived more than half an hour early, and, as he waited in the reception area for Shizune to arrive, he found he was too distracted to read to pass the time. He supposed he wasn't justified in his annoyance, though, as he had robbed himself of that comfortable return the moment he'd made the decision to lie to Tenzō. When Kakashi had agreed to recommend Tenzō for the lieutenant's exam this summer, despite lacking the credentials to do so, he'd knowingly activated the detonator switch on a colossal time bomb, and there were very few ways to defuse it. Before he'd even gotten word that he was being transferred back, before Tenzō's teeth had bitten down on his lower lip, arguably making the situation leagues more dire, Kakashi had already been through his options backward and forward and determined that there were really only two choices on the table for him. For a brief moment, he thought that perhaps he could ask Shizune. He was sure that she would be willing to make the recommendation, even with only his word to go off of. Unfortunately, though, this was not the reason he had now been waiting 20 minutes for Station 15's lieutenant in the empty, uninspired reception area of the firehouse. Shizune could not recommend Tenzō for the lieutenant's exam because the department required that the recommender had worked a minimum number of hours with the candidate. It was a rule in place to prevent nepotism, which, of course, made total sense. With this in mind, the only person truly eligible to recommend Tenzō for the exam was his own lieutenant, Ibizu. Kakashi didn't know the man well at all, and despite the fact that he had apparently earned Tsunade's stamp of approval after his stint at Station 15, Kakashi imagined that asking Ibizu to recommend Tenzō on his behalf would amount to the same thing as simply telling Tenzō the truth. It was highly unlikely that a request like that would stay secret for long when he and Ibizu had no relationship to speak of. And of course, that was one of the options on the table, telling Tenzō the truth. It probably would have been a better option if he had chosen it right there in that neighborhood coffee shop. He hadn't, though, and now this option would constitute telling Tenzō the next time they saw each other, which would be at Kakashi's own home in fewer than 36 hours for their planned dinner date. Kakashi had been worried before that telling Tenzō about his forfeiting of his rank might shatter the very fragile beginnings of whatever it was they had been fostering. Now, though, there was far more to lose. Those warm, full lips on his own, that broad, sturdy chest pressed against him, those fingers tangling up in his hair. Now that he'd experienced the way these things conjured up an unnameable emotion just strong enough to make him aware of how numb he'd been before, telling Tenzō wasn't a course of action Kakashi was willing to consider. That left him with just one choice. Kakashi would need to resit the lieutenant's exam himself in May so that he would be qualified to recommend Tenzō by the time recommendations were due in July for the August exam Tenzō planned to take. And the timing was going to be tight. A quick search of the department's website late the night before had revealed that the deadline for his own recommendation was today. And this was why he was impatiently pacing the reception area, waiting for Shizune to arrive. She'd be hard to corner alone once their shift officially started, and Kakashi had a strong preference for his decision to retake the lieutenant's exam, remaining a private one. Finally, just as some of the outgoing crew members were exiting the building, each throwing a wave in Kakashi's direction on their way out, Shizune appeared in the entryway into reception. She seemed to be on autopilot and nearly bypassed Kakashi completely, but appeared to register his presence after a moment, coming to a halt as she did. "Kakashi, I almost forgot it was your first day back," she said, and then, her expression turning concerned, she checked her watch. "Oh, and you're early," she exclaimed, her frown righting itself. "Do you have a minute?" Kakashi asked, choosing to ignore the fact that he was so habitually late that just seeing him at the station before her had apparently made Shizune question the time. Shizune looked somewhat caught off guard by the question, but nodded nonetheless. "Of course. What do you need?" Kakashi crossed his arms over his chest, hoping to appear casual. "It's nothing, really. I was just wondering if..." He trailed off as another few members of the previous shift's crew passed them by, waiting until they were out of earshot before continuing. "I was wondering if you'd be willing to recommend me to take the lieutenant's exam in May." Shizune didn't just look caught off guard now, she looked positively stunned, though she quickly and unsuccessfully tried to hide her surprise after briefly letting it blossom uninhibited across her features. "Oh, wow! I'm glad to hear that, of course," she said, seeming flustered. It occurred to Kakashi then that his regaining of his lieutenant rank would impact Shizune too. He'd been so singularly focused on how to preserve his reputation where Tenzō was concerned that he hadn't even stopped to consider the other ramifications of his decision. Now, as he stared at the woman in front of him as she tried to suppress whatever emotion she was experiencing, Kakashi's focus shifted, and he felt guilt creeping in. This was Shizune he was asking. The same person who had stepped up when he'd stepped down. The pinch hitter who had taken her own lieutenant's exam last minute so that she could assume all of the responsibilities he'd abandoned. "I'm not looking to replace you," Kakashi said quickly, uncrossing his arms and holding them up in a placating gesture, frustrated with himself for the lack of tact in his initial request. "You're a great lieutenant. I'm not even really looking to use the rank, really. I'm just... You don't have to explain anything to me. I'd be happy to recommend you," Shizune said, mercifully cutting him off as he attempted to explain something he couldn't. Kakashi searched her eyes for evidence of candor. It was the answer he'd wanted to hear, and, as important as it was to him to preserve what he and Tenzō were just starting to create, he wouldn't do it at the expense of a crewmate. "Are you sure?" he asked. "Yes, of course. It's just a formality, really," she said. "We both know you're qualified." "Thank you, Shizune," Kakashi said, noting that the guilt didn't seem to ease despite Shizune's words. Perhaps because he was, in a way, being dishonest with her as well. She undoubtedly believed he truly wanted to be a lieutenant again. Shizune smiled softly at him, polite and professional as always. "You're welcome. I'll check when the recommendation deadline is and get that written up and submitted." Kakashi returned the smile, though his was more apologetic. "The deadline is today, actually," he told her. "Oh," she said, blinking at him a few times. "Well then, I'll be sure to get it done this morning." And then, before he could thank her again, she started to trek down the hallway toward the rec room, looking back over her shoulder, clearly expecting him to follow. "Are you looking forward to seeing everyone again?" The welcome Kakashi had received in the rec room had been muted but friendly. It hadn't amounted to much more than a slap on the back from Guy, a handshake from Kurenai, a wave from Genma, and polite smiles from Iruka and Hana. After that, he was left to his own devices as everyone turned back to their own respective activities. Kakashi wasn't sure why the lack of fanfare surprised him. Perhaps he had simply gotten used to the bombastic nature of most of Station 10's crew members. Regardless, he was grateful. His mood was still somewhat deflated from his conversation with Shizune, and he was glad not to have been greeted by some exuberant receiving party. Instead, he had been allowed to settle back into what had been his normal seat on a leather recliner and read his book uninterrupted, simply waiting, with no other work to attend to, for the tones to sound and signal a call-out. He had been reading now for about 20 minutes, although he supposed it wouldn't be fair to call it reading, and not just because he nearly had Make-Out Paradise memorized. In truth, he'd read for maybe the first 5 minutes, before he'd abandoned the effort after rereading the same paragraph 3 times without really absorbing it. While he still had the book up to his face, he was now surreptitiously peering over the top of the pages, surveying his crewmates. Kakashi had gotten used to interruptions at Station 10. Not only was that station, simply by virtue of location, the busiest station in the district, but the crew there had rarely left him to his own devices for long once they had gotten to know him well enough. He couldn't remember ever having gotten more than a couple pages in before someone had been tapping him on his shoulder, shouting a lewd quote at him, or attempting to hit him with a well-aimed ball from the foosball table. He'd often wistfully thought of all the space he was given at Station 15 and admonished himself for taking it for granted. Now, though, it struck him as odd. It had become quite obvious at Station 10, particularly upon the reaction to his leaving, that the crew had been a menace to him out of affection. They had enjoyed his company and so had tried to keep him from hiding away or distracting himself. What did it say about his relationship with his home crew at Station 15 that they had no interest in engaging with him? It certainly hadn't always been like that. Back before Obito and Rin had died, Kakashi could remember Station 15, albeit made up of some different faces, being a lively place. He didn't think the change could be attributed to the new personalities on the crew either. Sure, nobody was as loud and rambunctious as Obito, but Genma was far from shy. In the brief time Kakashi had gotten to know Hana, she had proven to be quite a loud mouth herself. Even Iruka, though quiet for the most part, had been coming out of his shell to reveal a verifiable congenial personality by the time Kakashi had left. But if it wasn't the crew's personalities that accounted for the subdued atmosphere, then what was it? Kakashi frowned behind the pages of his book. He had a feeling he knew the answer, but was almost loath to confirm it. His curiosity was too piqued to stop himself from testing his hypothesis, though. He looked around the room for a target and settled easily on Iruka. The young man was seated at a small table by the window, eyebrows furrowed in concentration as he stared at the newspaper crossword puzzle on the table before him. He held a pen in his hand, a bold choice, Kakashi thought, and he was intermittently clicking the pen open and closed furiously as he apparently tried to work out one of the puzzle's clues. After a particularly fervent flurry of clicks, Kakashi spoke up from behind his book. "If you're attempting Morse code with that pen, Iruka, I'm afraid you need more practice." Iruka's head shot up immediately, and his wide, surprised eyes connected with Kakashi's. He dropped the pen onto the table. "Sorry!" he exclaimed. Kakashi felt his heart sink. He could feel the eyes of everyone else in the room on him as he lowered his book into his lap. "I'm only joking," he told Iruka, his voice sounding resigned even to his own ears. It seemed to take Iruka a moment to process this, but as he did, his features relaxed. "Oh," he said as he picked up his pen again. "Right." Kakashi scrutinized the reactions of his other teammates. It looked to be mostly relieved smiles, with the exception of a calculating stare from Genma and a sparkling grin from Guy. Kakashi raised his book back up to his face, but he still wasn't ready to read. It was confirmed. The crew at Station 15 was on eggshells around him. They probably had been for years without him ever noticing. And with good reason, too. If his making a joke was this unexpected, he wondered how long it had been since he'd last done so. Had he been so bogged down and entrenched in his own misery that he'd soured the entire firehouse's atmosphere without even realizing it? Kakashi wasn't allowed to dwell on this question much longer, as his thoughts were interrupted by the long, deafening tones that indicated a call-out was imminent. The call-out had been nothing spectacular. Commercial kitchen fires were, unfortunately, fairly common. While there had been a brief and somewhat embarrassing moment when Kakashi had, on instinct, made for the passenger seat of the engine before realizing that that was Shizune's place, everything else about the job had been routine. No injuries, and, though the restaurant owner would certainly need to replace some equipment and have some cleaning done, no structural damage to the building either. Still, Kakashi, Kurenai, Hana, and Iruka remained in the building, ensuring that there was nothing that might cause the fire to reignite, and reviewing the path of the fire and the nature of the damage. This was standard procedure, but Kakashi was sure that the crew at Station 15, much like the crew at Station 10, had been conducting these steps a little more thoroughly in the wake of the 5 arsons that had occurred in the past 6 months. The perpetrator, to Kakashi's knowledge, had yet to be apprehended. When he was satisfied with what he saw, Kakashi turned to Hana. She was crouched in front of the commercial range that had been the ignition point. "See anything out of the ordinary, Hana?" he asked her. She looked up at him, eyebrows raised. She turned back to the range and gave it another look over before rising to her feet. She squinted around the room as if looking for something. When she failed to find it, she returned her gaze to meet Kakashi's. "No," she responded finally, sounding somewhat defeated. Kakashi nodded noncommittally. "Iruka?" he asked, focusing his attention on the other probationary team member. Iruka appeared to scrutinize the scene even more vigorously than Hana, frowning in concentration as his eyes traced the path the flame had taken. Kakashi could see that Kurenai had stopped her own inspection to watch what was occurring. Kakashi looked away from Iruka just a moment to catch her eye. She looked suspicious. Kakashi felt the corner of his lips twitch, giving away more than he'd meant to, and he watched as Kurenai clocked it, a small smile blossoming across her face. "No," Iruka answered, sounding more confident than Hana had. "One ignition source, no signs of accelerant, burn pattern is typical," he elaborated. Kakashi looked between Iruka and Hana, waiting just long enough to see if one of them would change their answer based on his silence. They didn't. "I agree," he told them, and couldn't help but smile at the relief on both of their faces. "Textbook. Good work." "Hey, Kakashi!" Genma's voice rang out into the room, and Kakashi turned around to see him leaning into the propped-open doorway that led to the building's back lot. "Shizune's asking for the preliminary. What have we got?" he asked. "Tell her no signs of arson. Iruka and Hana have checked thoroughly," Kakashi said, catching a glimpse of Kurenai's widening smile in his peripheral vision. "You got it, Loot," Genma said, beginning to head back out, but then stopping himself and leaning back into the room. "Shit, sorry," he said. Kakashi stared at him. "For what?" There was no immediate response from Genma. Kakashi got the feeling that he was missing something. Genma looked at him, lips parted like he didn't know how to answer the question. Kakashi heard the sound of a boot of one of the 2 firefighters behind him scuffing on the floor. And then it hit him. Oh, he choked out, feeling foolish. "It's fine," he placated. "Don't worry about it." Genma retreated then, though not before exchanging what seemed like a meaningful look with Kurenai. Kakashi removed his helmet, wiping the sweat from his brow with a gloved hand. Now that he thought about it, when was the last time he had corrected someone for calling him lieutenant? Kakashi was just putting his plate from dinner into the dishwasher when Tsunade's commanding voice filled the kitchen. "Hatake, got 10 minutes?" she asked, crossing her arms over her chest. "I thought you were working at Station 10 until they find a new captain," Genma said, leaning back in his chair at the kitchen table to get a better look at their captain. "I think I'm allowed to come and go as I please without your permission," Tsunade quipped back. Kakashi closed the dishwasher, looking back to the table at Shizune, whose drawn-together eyebrows, wide eyes, and bit lip clearly meant both, "I'm sorry I told Tsunade," and also, "I didn't tell her to come here." Kakashi sighed, turning back to Tsunade. "Your office?" he asked. "My office," she agreed, heading out of the room and leading the way down the hall. Once they were both seated on either side of Tsunade's neatly kept captain's desk, she folded her hands in front of herself and leaned forward, fixing Kakashi with a mischievous glare. "Anything you want to tell me?" she asked, feigning innocence. Kakashi didn't answer right away. He avoided her gaze, looking out the window instead. The days were getting longer now that it was spring and the sun hadn't quite set yet. The trees outside were silhouetted against a deep tangerine sky. Tsunade, having been off-site, had been, in his opinion as of this morning, the only good thing about having to request that Shizune recommend him for the lieutenant's exam. He had counted himself lucky to not have to be on the receiving end of her smug satisfaction. She would no doubt believe her plan of sending him off to Station 10 to convince him to retake the exam had worked, and he would, of course, be unable to divulge the real reasoning behind his decision. But things looked different to Kakashi with his first day back behind him now. He couldn't deny that his time at Station 10 had changed him. His eyes were open now to how disengaged he'd been with his home crew since Obito and Rin had passed. He'd seen the looks on Kurenai's and Guy's faces as they'd watched him, the new him, interact with others like he used to. He'd seen the way Iruka had straightened up with pride when he'd passed Kakashi's test. He'd heard Hana telling Genma about it later in the day. All of these things had made him feel something he hadn't felt in quite some time. And when Kakashi added all of it up, he was forced to come to one conclusion. He did want his rank back. Tsunade's plan had worked after all. The spark was back. The passion was back. "I do, actually," Kakashi said, turning back to face his captain after a very generous pause. "Thank you, Tsunade." Tsunade blinked at him, looking a little startled by his answer. Perhaps she expected something less honest or more snarky. "Well then," she said, leaning back in her chair, "you're welcome. I just wanted to come by and let you know myself how proud I am of you, kid," she said. Kakashi let the words sink in for a breath or two. Tsunade wasn't one to get sentimental, and neither was he, so the moment meant something, and Kakashi gave it its due respect, letting it hold weight between them for at least a second longer before righting the atmosphere. "I don't know," he countered. "I think you just wanted to come here to gloat," he told her, raising one eyebrow. Tsunade grinned back at him sinisterly. "I'm above that," she insisted, "but if I weren't, I'd be totally justified." "Right," Kakashi agreed dismissively, standing from his seat and heading toward the door. "And hey," Tsunade exclaimed, "don't think I didn't see you and Tenzō making googly eyes at each other when you were saying goodbyes." Kakashi stopped short of the door in the hallway, not turning around to reward Tsunade with how red he was sure his face was. "I guess we pulled you out just in time," she continued. "Just don't blow it. I have money on you finally getting laid before you turn 30. It's Emily OFC Podfix.